September 5, 1944. 0700 hours. The outskirts of Verdun, France. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz stood in a commandeered schoolhouse, studying intelligence reports that made no sense. The documents spread across the table described American tank formations approaching the Moselle River. The numbers couldn't be right. According to German Army Group G intelligence, the American Third Army possessed perhaps 300 tanks, maybe 400. The Wehrmacht had fought them throughout August. They'd counted destroyed Shermans. They'd interrogated prisoners. They'd tracked unit movements. The assessment seemed solid. But the reports coming from forward positions told a different story. American armor was appearing everywhere simultaneously. Reconnaissance patrols reported Sherman tanks at Nancy. Other units spotted American columns near Metz. Still more tanks were identified moving toward Thionville. The Americans couldn't be in all those places at once. Not with 300 tanks. The numbers didn't work. Blaskowitz commanded Army Group G, responsible for defending the approaches to Germany through Lorraine and Alsace. His forces had been retreating since Normandy. The withdrawal had been chaotic. Units were scattered, communications were disrupted, intelligence gathering suffered. But his staff officers were professionals. They understood armor warfare. They knew how to count tanks. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The intelligence officer, Oberst Werner Noth, entered the room carrying more reports. Noth had served in Poland, France, and Russia. He'd spent 4 years tracking enemy formations. He knew his job. He placed the latest reconnaissance summaries on the table. American tank columns identified near Pont-à-Mousson. Sherman formations observed crossing the Meuse. Armor concentrations building, west of Nancy. Each report documented specific sightings, times, locations, unit markings. Blaskowitz did the arithmetic. If the Americans had tanks at all these locations, operating simultaneously, they possessed far more than 300 vehicles, double that number, maybe triple. His intelligence estimate was wrong, catastrophically wrong. Either that, or American tank production had increased beyond anything German planners anticipated. The Wehrmacht's intelligence services had been tracking American industrial output since 1941. The Abwehr maintained detailed files on American factories. They knew Ford built tanks in Michigan. They knew Chrysler operated an arsenal in Detroit. They'd identified every major American production facility. German analysts had calculated maximum possible output based on factory size, workforce numbers, and production techniques. Those calculations suggested the United States could manufacture approximately 1,500 tanks monthly. By late 1944, total American armor strength in Europe should number around 4,000 tanks. That total had to support operations in France, Italy, and reserve formations in England. The Third Army represented one American field army among several. Logic suggested Patton commanded perhaps 20% of available American armor, 700 to 800 tanks. The Germans had destroyed hundreds of American tanks since June. Natural attrition from mechanical failure reduced the number further. 300 operational tanks seemed a reasonable estimate. Blaskowitz looked at the map. Third Army positions were marked in blue. German defensive lines appeared in red. The American advance had covered 400 miles in 1 month. That pace required enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The supply lines stretched from Normandy beaches to eastern France. Such extended logistics should have constrained American offensive capability, should have forced them to pause, to consolidate, to wait for supplies to catch up. Instead, the Americans kept coming. Patton's forces had reached the Meuse River in late August. They'd crossed the Moselle at multiple points in early September. Now they threatened both Nancy and Metz. The advance showed no signs of stopping. The operational tempo suggested the Americans possessed far more resources than German intelligence credited them with. Blaskowitz had commanded forces in Poland during the 1939 campaign. He'd seen German armor warfare at its peak. The Wehrmacht had employed 1,500 tanks during the invasion of Poland. Those 1,500 panzers had overwhelmed Polish defences in 18 days. Germany's industrial base, fully mobilized for war since 1933, had required years to build that force. America, which had possessed virtually no tank production capability in 1939, apparently was now deploying similar numbers in a single field army. 5 years after the war began, the industrial transformation required was staggering. Building tanks wasn't like manufacturing automobiles. Tanks required specialized armor plate, precise machining, complex transmissions, sophisticated gun systems, trained crews, maintenance infrastructure, spare parts, supply chains. The entire industrial ecosystem needed to support armored warfare took years to develop. Germany had learned this lesson in the 1920s and 30s. The Reichswehr had spent a decade developing armor doctrine and production capability after World War I restrictions were lifted. Even with that head start, Germany could only produce limited numbers. Peak German tank production in 1943 reached 1,500 units monthly. That was after 4 years of total war, with every resource prioritized for military production. The Americans had entered the war in December 1941, less than 3 years ago. Their tank production should still be ramping up. Learning curves should still constrain output. Quality control issues should plague early production. Yet here they were, fielding what appeared to be thousands of tanks in France alone. The mathematics suggested American industry had accomplished in 3 years what took Germany a decade. Blaskowitz considered another possibility. Perhaps American tanks were inferior, poorly built, unreliable, quantity over quality. German intelligence had detailed specifications on the M4 Sherman. The tank was mechanically simple, moderately armoured, armed with a 75mm gun adequate against German Mark IV Panzers but ineffective against Panthers or Tigers. The Sherman was a competent medium tank, but nothing exceptional. German tank crews who'd fought Shermans in Normandy reported mixed results. The Sherman caught fire easily when penetrated. Crews called it the Ronson, after an American cigarette lighter that advertised "lights every time." German tankers could destroy Shermans at long range. A Panther's gun could penetrate Sherman frontal armor from 2,000 meters. The Sherman had to close within 1,000 meters to have any chance of damaging a Panther. Yet the Shermans kept coming. For every one destroyed, 2 more appeared. German tank losses were permanent. Replacement Panzers took months to arrive from factories in Germany. When they did arrive, they often broke down from mechanical issues or lacked spare parts. American tank losses seemed meaningless. Destroyed Shermans were replaced within days, sometimes hours. The Americans treated tanks as expendable equipment, not precious resources. That operational approach revealed something about American production. You could only consider tanks expendable if you had so many that individual losses didn't matter. The Wehrmacht could never operate that way. Every panzer represented months of production. Losing a single tank impacted division combat power measurably. German commanders husbanded their armor carefully, avoiding unnecessary risks. American commanders showed no such caution. Patton threw tanks into combat with abandon. Lost vehicles? Build more. Destroyed battalions? Replace them. The attitude suggested unlimited industrial capacity, which brought Blaskowitz back to his original problem. How many tanks did the Americans actually have? Noth offered his assessment. American tank strength in the European theatre probably exceeded 6,000 vehicles. Third Army represented the most powerful American field army in France. Patton likely commanded 1,200 to 1,500 tanks, perhaps more. The intelligence estimate of 300 was wrong by a factor of 4 or 5. Blaskowitz absorbed the information. 1,500 American tanks were advancing toward his defensive positions. He commanded approximately 400 German tanks and assault guns scattered across Army Group G's entire front. The disparity was worse than he'd thought. Worse than anyone in Berlin understood. The Americans didn't just have numerical superiority, they had overwhelming numerical dominance. This wasn't 1940. In France, German panzers had enjoyed 2-to-1 superiority over French and British armour. The Wehrmacht had won through superior tactics, training, and numbers. Now, the situation was reversed. American forces possessed the numerical advantage. And while German tanks were qualitatively superior, quantity mattered in industrial warfare. Blaskowitz had studied World War I. He'd read about material attrition, about artillery barrages measured in millions of shells, about armies grinding each other down through the pure weight of resources. The Great War had taught a brutal lesson. In industrial conflict, the side with greater production capacity eventually won. Quality mattered, training mattered, leadership mattered, but industrial output mattered more. Germany was fighting that war again. Except this time, Germany faced enemies with far greater industrial capacity. The Soviet Union produced thousands of tanks annually from factories beyond the Ural Mountains. Britain manufactured aircraft, ships, and vehicles in facilities safe from German bombing. And America, untouched by war, operated the largest industrial economy in human history. The numbers were public information. American steel production exceeded 80 million tons annually. Germany produced 30 million. The United States manufactured 11 million automobiles in 1941 before converting to war production. Germany had never built more than 300,000 cars in a single year. The automotive production infrastructure that made America wealthy in peacetime was now producing war material at scales Germany couldn't match. Blaskowitz understood what this meant. The war was lost. Not lost in September 1944, lost years earlier when Germany declared war on America. The outcome had been determined by industrial capacity, not by battlefield tactics. Germany could win every battle and still lose the war. Because America could replace losses, Germany could not. But understanding the strategic situation didn't change Blaskowitz's immediate problem. He had to defend Lorraine. Hitler had ordered all positions held. Retreat without permission meant court-martial, possibly execution. Blaskowitz couldn't surrender, couldn't withdraw, couldn't even maneuver freely without Berlin's approval. He had to fight with what he had. 400 tanks against 1,500. Infantry divisions depleted their battalion strength. Artillery units short of ammunition. Air support was non-existent. The Luftwaffe had been driven from French skies. American fighter bombers controlled the air completely. P-47. Thunderbolts attacked German columns in daylight with impunity. Any vehicle that moved on roads during daytime was destroyed. Supply trucks, fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, all gone. German logistics had collapsed. Units at the front received irregular supplies. Sometimes rations arrived, sometimes ammunition, rarely both. The fuel situation was critical. German panzers required enormous quantities of gasoline. A Panther tank consumed 200 litres per 100 kilometres under combat conditions. A Tiger consumed even more. Army Group G possessed perhaps 100 Panthers and 50 Tigers. Operating them required thousands of litres of fuel daily. The supply system could deliver perhaps half that amount. The result? Panzers sat immobilized, conserving fuel, unable to maneuver. American Shermans, by contrast, appeared to have unlimited fuel. Reconnaissance reports described American tank columns moving constantly, refueling in the field, operating 24 hours daily. The Americans had solved logistics at industrial scale. They'd built the infrastructure, the supply depots, the transport networks, everything required to keep thousands of tanks moving, simultaneously. Blaskowitz examined casualty reports from the August fighting. The numbers told a disturbing story. German forces had destroyed hundreds of American tanks throughout Normandy and the pursuit across France. Kill ratios favoured German armour. A single Panther could destroy multiple Shermans. But the tactical success was strategically meaningless. The Americans replaced losses faster than Germany inflicted them. In Normandy, German forces had destroyed approximately 400 Allied tanks in July alone. By August, Allied tank strength hadn't decreased. It had increased. More Shermans, more Cromwells, more of everything. American production and British imports replaced losses within weeks. German tank losses from the same period? Permanent. Those panzers were gone. Forever. The Wehrmacht had lost approximately 1,200 tanks between D-Day and the end of August. Replacements? Perhaps 300. German factories produced tanks, but Allied bombing disrupted production. Rail networks couldn't deliver vehicles to France. When panzers did arrive, they often had mechanical issues. The vaunted German technical superiority meant complex machines that broke frequently and required skilled mechanics to repair. Mechanics, who were increasingly scarce as experienced personnel, were killed or captured. Noth pointed out another problem. American tank crews were improving. In Normandy, many American tankers were inexperienced, fresh from training, uncertain under fire. German veterans had slaughtered them. But survivors learned quickly. By September, American tank commanders understood German tactics. They'd adapted. I learned to use superior numbers effectively, learned to combine armor with infantry, learned to call for air support. American combined arms coordination was becoming frighteningly effective. Sherman tanks would pin German positions while infantry maneuvered. Artillery would suppress anti-tank guns. Fighter bombers would strike any German vehicle that revealed itself. The system didn't require individual brilliance. It required good communication, adequate supplies, and overwhelming force. America provided all three. Blaskowitz considered his options. Nancy was threatened. Metz was threatened. Thionville was threatened. He lacked the forces to defend all three adequately. Hitler's orders demanded every position be held. Blaskowitz couldn't comply. The mathematics didn't work. Defending everywhere meant being strong nowhere. Concentrating forces to hold one city meant abandoning others. Either choice violated orders. He decided on Metz. The fortress city had been fortified since Roman times. The Germans had strengthened the defences between 1870 and 1918. Massive concrete forts ringed the city, interconnected tunnels, artillery positions, machine gun bunkers, infantry trenches. Metz was the strongest defensive position in Lorraine. If the Third Army wanted Metz, Patton would have to fight, for every metre. The defensive plan had a fatal flaw: static defence, fortifications. Hitler loved both. The Führer believed willpower and concrete could stop enemy armour. History suggested otherwise. The French Maginot Line had magnificent fortifications. Germany had bypassed them. The Atlantic Wall had been impressive. The Allies had breached it in hours. Fortifications only worked if you could defend them actively. Counterattack. Maneuver. Use mobile reserves. Blaskowitz had no mobile reserves. His panzers were scattered. His infantry was exhausted. His supplies were inadequate. He was being asked to defend Metz with forces sufficient to delay an American advance, not stop it. The outcome was predetermined. American material superiority would prevail. Eventually, the only question was how long Blaskowitz could hold, how many casualties he could inflict, how much time he could buy for Germany. Time for what? That question had no good answer. Time for wonder weapons to be deployed? The V-2 rockets weren't changing the war. Time for political collapse among the Allies? Unlikely. Time for a miracle? Miracles didn't win wars. Production won wars. And production favoured the Americans absolutely. Blaskowitz issued orders. Defend Metz, delay the American advance at Nancy, fight for time. He knew what would happen. Third Army would attack. American tanks would appear in overwhelming numbers. American artillery would destroy German positions. American infantry would occupy the ruins. The defense would collapse. Eventually. But orders were orders. He would fight. The reality behind American steel, September 7th, 1944, Third Army Headquarters, Châlons-en-Champagne, France. Lieutenant General George S. Patton stood before a wall-sized map of eastern France, tracking his division's progress toward the German border. Blue markers represented American positions. They stretched from Reims in the north to Epinal in the south, a front spanning 200 miles. Behind those frontline positions, hundreds more markers indicated supply depots, maintenance facilities, fuel dumps, and reserve formations. Each marker represented American military power, industrial power, the accumulated production of 3 years of total mobilization. Patton's Third Army possessed 4,197 tanks as of the morning count. Not 300, not 800, over 4,000 armored fighting vehicles distributed across 12 divisions. The number wasn't secret, it wasn't propaganda, it was logistics, mathematics, the inevitable result of American industrial capacity applied to warfare. The Germans had been counting American tanks since D-Day. They'd watched Shermans roll off landing craft at Normandy. They'd destroyed hundreds of them throughout July and August. They'd calculated American strength based on observed losses and estimated replacement rates. Every calculation underestimated actual American capability. German intelligence officers, trained in European warfare, couldn't conceive of the industrial scale America operated at. Their frame of reference was wrong. Colonel Oscar Koch, Third Army's intelligence officer, entered with updated reconnaissance reports. Koch had been tracking German dispositions for months. He understood Blaskowitz's situation perfectly. Army Group G was disintegrating. German forces had perhaps 400 operational tanks across their entire front, maybe 300 infantry pieces of artillery. Ammunition stocks were critically low. Fuel deliveries had nearly stopped. The Wehrmacht was attempting to defend Lorraine with forces that would have been inadequate in 1940 when Germany was winning. Patton studied the numbers. 4,000 American tanks versus 400 German panzers, 10-1 superiority. The disparity was greater than German intelligence estimated, greater than even optimistic American planners had hoped for. This wasn't battlefield advantage. This was industrial domination, the kind of material superiority that made tactical skill almost irrelevant. When you possessed 10 tanks for every enemy tank, you could afford mistakes. Lose vehicles, take casualties, keep attacking. Eventually, mathematics prevailed. The Sherman tank wasn't the finest tank in the war. Patton knew that. Everyone knew that. German Panthers were better protected, better armed, more feared by Allied tankers. A Panther could destroy a Sherman from ranges the Sherman couldn't effectively return fire. Tank-for-tank comparisons favored German equipment. But wars weren't won by individual tank duels. Wars were won by armies, by divisions, by the accumulated weight of industrial production. American industry had delivered 4,000 tanks to the Third Army. Those Shermans weren't distributed evenly. The 12 armored divisions under Patton's command each had approximately 250 tanks. Infantry divisions included attached tank battalions with another 60 to 70 vehicles. Tank destroyer battalions added hundreds more tracked vehicles. The organizational structure reflected American doctrine. Tanks everywhere, in every division, supporting every operation. Armor wasn't concentrated in elite formations. It was distributed throughout the army. German armor organization was different. The Wehrmacht concentrated panzers in specialized divisions. Panzer divisions received the best equipment, the most experienced crews, priority for supplies. Infantry divisions had minimal armor support. The approach created powerful striking forces, but left most of the army without significant tank support. German doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, elite formations over broad capability. American doctrine went the opposite direction. Spread tanks everywhere, give every division armor support, accept that individual tanks were outmatched by German vehicles. Compensate through numbers and combined arms coordination. The approach required enormous production capacity. You needed thousands of tanks to equip dozens of divisions. Germany couldn't produce at that scale. America could. Patton walked to another map, showing supply routes from Normandy beaches to Third Army positions. Red lines traced roads, rail lines, and supply depots across France. The logistics network supporting 4,000 tanks was staggering. Each Sherman required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance support. Multiply those requirements by 4,000 vehicles, and the supply demands became astronomical. Third Army consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily. That fuel arrived via a supply line stretching 300 miles from Normandy. Trucks moved constantly, carrying 5-gallon jerrycans forward to refueling points. Engineers had repaired damaged roads and bridges. Quartermasters established fuel dumps every 50 miles. The entire system operated 24 hours daily, feeding the advance. The Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system, delivered supplies specifically to Patton's forces. 6,000 trucks operated continuously, driving one-way routes at high speed. Drivers worked in shifts, pushing loads forward, racing back empty for more supplies. The truck drivers, predominantly African-American units, kept Third Army mobile when rail networks remained damaged from Allied bombing. The trucks consumed fuel themselves, requiring complex calculations to ensure net positive supply delivery. Ammunition consumption matched fuel usage. American tanks carried 71 shells for the main gun. In combat, crews expended ammunition rapidly. Fire, reload, fire again. Aggressive American tactics emphasized volume of fire over precision shooting. Spot a target? Shoot. Uncertain target? Shoot anyway. The doctrine worked because ammunition was plentiful. Supply trucks brought forward shells by the thousands. American industry produced artillery ammunition at rates German factories couldn't approach. Third Army fired more artillery shells in September 1944 than the entire German army fired on the Western Front that month. The comparison wasn't close. American Corps artillery battalions could request ammunition without quantity restrictions. Fire missions were limited only by barrel wear and crew exhaustion, not ammunition shortages. German artillery officers rationed every shell, fired only when targets were certain, conserved ammunition because resupply was uncertain. The industrial disparity extended beyond tanks and shells. Spare parts availability determined operational readiness. American maintenance doctrine assumed parts would fail. Transmissions broke, engines wore out, track links separated. The solution wasn't building more reliable tanks. The solution was producing spare parts in massive quantities and establishing maintenance networks that could swap components rapidly. Every American armored division included a maintenance battalion, 600 mechanics, specialized equipment, mobile machine shops, recovery vehicles that could retrieve damaged tanks from battlefields. The entire support structure assumed mechanical failures were normal, expected, manageable through logistics rather than prevention. German maintenance operations struggled by comparison. Spare parts were scarce. Mechanics were overworked. Recovery vehicles were often unavailable. When a German tank broke down, it might remain disabled for weeks awaiting parts. When an American Sherman broke down, it was often back in operation within days, sometimes hours. The operational availability rate, the percentage of tanks ready for combat at any moment, favored American forces significantly. Third Army's tank strength of 4,000 vehicles didn't mean all 4,000 were combat-ready simultaneously. Perhaps 3,000 were operational on any given day. The other 1,000 were undergoing maintenance, repair, or waiting for spare parts. But that maintenance cycle was fast. Broken tanks were fixed quickly. The operational availability rate remained high because the support infrastructure functioned effectively. German operational availability was worse. Of 400 nominal tank strength, perhaps 300 were actually combat-ready. Mechanical reliability issues plagued German armor. Panthers had transmission problems. Tigers had engine issues. Even the reliable Mark IV Panzers suffered from inadequate maintenance. The German support infrastructure couldn't keep pace with mechanical demands. Skilled mechanics were scarce. Parts were unavailable. The operational availability rate declined steadily throughout 1944. Patton understood these numbers intimately. Third Army succeeded not through tactical brilliance, but through relentless pressure enabled by material superiority. Attack constantly. Don't pause. Don't wait. Keep moving. If tanks broke down, leave them for maintenance units. Keep advancing with operational vehicles. The approach only worked because replacement tanks kept arriving, because spare parts were available, because fuel trucks kept rolling forward. The German defensive strategy couldn't counter this operational tempo. Blaskowitz needed to concentrate forces, strike American spearheads, destroy exposed units, force Patton to pause and consolidate. Classic mobile defense. The approach required fuel for panzers to maneuver, ammunition for sustained combat, air cover to protect moving columns. Army Group G lacked all three. German forces could defend fixed positions. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't counterattack effectively, couldn't disrupt American operations. Koch briefed Patton on German dispositions around Metz. Blaskowitz was concentrating forces there. The fortress city's defences were formidable. Concrete forts, artillery positions, infantry strongpoints. Taking Metz would require siege warfare, costly, time-consuming, exactly what Patton wanted to avoid. Third Army's strength was mobility. 4,000 tanks could maneuver, could bypass strongpoints, could penetrate weak sectors and exploit breakthroughs. Getting bogged down in urban combat negated American advantages. Patton preferred to bypass Metz entirely. Let the fortress city wither, starve it of supplies. Force surrender through isolation rather than direct assault. But Supreme Headquarters wanted Metz captured. The city's location along the Moselle River made it strategically significant. Railroad junctions passed through Metz. Controlling the city would ease logistics for future operations toward Germany. Eisenhower's staff believed Metz had to fall before the Third Army could continue eastward. Patton disagreed but followed orders. The plan involved 12 Corps and XX Corps attacking simultaneously. 12 Corps would advance on Nancy from the south. XX Corps would envelope Metz from multiple directions. Combined, the two corps controlled over 1,500 tanks, artillery battalions numbering in the hundreds, infantry divisions at near full strength, air support from P-47 fighter-bomber squadrons. The force assembling to attack Metz exceeded the entire German strength in Lorraine. American tactical doctrine for armoured operations had evolved since Normandy. Early battles had been costly. Sherman tanks advancing against prepared German positions suffered heavy losses. American crews learned, adapted, developed techniques that leveraged numerical superiority while minimizing casualties. The new approach emphasized combined arms coordination. Tanks didn't charge German positions alone. Infantry accompanied armor, clearing anti-tank guns. Artillery suppressed German strongpoints before tanks advanced. Engineers removed obstacles and mines. Air support struck any German position that revealed itself. The coordinated attacks were methodical, systematic, overwhelming. German defenders couldn't counter all threats simultaneously. Focus on stopping. Tanks? American infantry infiltrated. Concentrate on infantry? Sherman tanks flanked positions. Deploy anti-tank guns? Artillery destroyed them. Try to maneuver? Airstrikes caught moving columns. The combined arms approach didn't require genius. It required adequate communication, sufficient resources, and persistent execution. Third Army had all three. Radio communication gave American forces coordination advantages. Every tank had a radio. Company commanders could talk to battalion headquarters. Artillery observers could call fire missions instantly. Air liaison officers could request fighter-bomber support within minutes. The communication network enabled rapid responses to battlefield developments. Spot a German position? Call artillery. Need air support? Request it. Lost contact with friendly units? Radio for information. German communication infrastructure was degrading. Radio equipment was scarce. Telephone wires were cut by artillery. Messengers were killed or captured. Communication failures meant German units operated in isolation. Company commanders didn't know battalion situations. Artillery couldn't coordinate with infantry. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered. The Wehrmacht's tactical proficiency eroded as communication networks collapsed. Patton reviewed the attack timeline. 12 Corps would attack Nancy on September 7th. XX Corps would begin operations against Metz on September 8th. Both attacks would commence with massive artillery preparation, hundreds of guns firing thousands of shells. The bombardment would last hours, destroy German positions, suppress defenders, create chaos, then tanks would advance, infantry would follow, Engineers would clear obstacles, air support would strike targets of opportunity. The attacking force included elements from the 2nd, 5th, and 7th Armoured Divisions, the 26th, 35th, 80th, and 90th Infantry Divisions, supporting artillery from Corps and Army assets. Over 100,000 men, 1,500 tanks, 600 artillery pieces. The concentration of force exceeded anything the Germans could assemble for defensive operations. Blaskowitz had maybe 40,000 men defending the entire sector, 400 tanks scattered across 200 miles of front, artillery ammunition rationed to essential missions only, no air support, no reserves, no reinforcements expected. The defensive situation was hopeless. Everyone knew it. German commanders knew it. American intelligence knew it. Even the individual soldiers probably understood, but orders were orders. Defend or die trying. The industrial capacity that built 4,000 tanks for the Third Army continued operating. American factories produced new Shermans daily. 1,500 tanks are manufactured monthly. Those vehicles were shipped to Europe, distributed to replacement depots, issued to units as needed. The production pipeline ensured American tank strength remained constant despite combat losses. Destroyed Shermans were replaced automatically. The system functioned like an assembly line. Thanks in. Thanks, continuous flow. German tank production couldn't match that output. 1,500 panzers monthly represented peak German production. Reality was lower. Allied bombing disrupted factories. Labor shortages constrained output. Raw material scarcities limited production. Actual German tank production, in September 1944, was perhaps 800 vehicles. Those vehicles had to support operations in France, Italy, and the Eastern Front. Third Army faced a fraction of total German production, maybe 50 to 100 replacement tanks monthly. Not nearly enough. The war was being decided by industrial statistics, steel production, aluminum output, machine tool availability, electrical generation capacity, trained workforce numbers. All favored the Allies. Specifically, favored America. The United States outproduced Germany in every measurable category. The gap was widening. American industry was still expanding. German industry was contracting under Allied bombing. Patton understood this reality better than most combat commanders. He'd visited American factories before deploying to Europe. He'd seen Sherman production lines at Chrysler's Detroit arsenal, watched tanks roll off assembly lines every few hours, talked to workers who explained production processes, learned that building tanks was now routine, standardized, efficient. Industrial America had solved tank production the same way it solved automobile production: mass production, interchangeable parts, trained workers, quality control. The system produced thousands of vehicles monthly, reliably, predictably. That industrial capability translated to battlefield power. 4,000 tanks in the Third Army, more tanks in the First Army, more in British forces, more arriving weekly. The accumulated steel represented America's answer to Wehrmacht: tactical skill. We'll outproduce you. Build more tanks than you can destroy. Replace losses faster than you inflict them. Win through industrial attrition. The strategy lacked elegance. It was brutal, mechanical, impersonal. But it worked. American tankers died. Shermans burned. Units suffered casualties. Yet the Third Army kept advancing. Because behind every destroyed tank were 10 more rolling forward. Behind those 10 were 100 more at depots. Behind those hundreds were thousands more in production. The industrial machine was relentless. September 8th arrived. XX Corps began operations against Metz. Artillery preparation commenced at 0530 hours. 600 guns firing simultaneously. The bombardment could be heard 50 miles away. German positions disappeared under high explosive shells. Concrete forts that had stood since 1870 cracked under modern artillery. Infantry strongpoints were obliterated. Communication trenches collapsed. The preliminary bombardment was designed to destroy defensive capability before tanks ever moved. At 0700 hours, Sherman tanks advanced. wave after wave, companies, battalions, entire regiments. German defenders who survived the artillery bombardment watched in disbelief as hundreds of American tanks appeared. The reconnaissance reports hadn't been wrong. American armor strength was overwhelming. Literally overwhelming. So many tanks that counting them was difficult. German anti-tank guns fired, destroyed Shermans, knocked out dozens of vehicles. It didn't matter. More tanks kept coming. The battle for Metz would last weeks. American forces would suffer thousands of casualties. Hundreds of tanks would be destroyed. But the outcome was never in doubt. Third Army had 4,000 tanks. Blaskowitz had 400. Mathematics determined the result. American industrial power, mobilized for 3 years, applied to a single sector of the Western Front, produced overwhelming combat capability. The Germans couldn't counter it, couldn't stop it, could only delay the inevitable. Patton's Third Army rolled toward Germany, not because of tactical genius, not because of superior training, because of tanks, thousands of tanks, built in Detroit, shipped to France, maintained by mechanics, fueled by trucks, supplied by an industrial system that Germany couldn't match. The war was ending, not in September 1944, but eventually, inevitably, American industrial capacity guaranteed it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.